We are commencing legal action against Mrs. Meghan Markle. Her televised allegations, particularly the Oprah interview, have inflicted undue harm upon the royal family. An apology no longer suffices. The matter will now proceed through the...
The hesitation is over. King Charles has placed his signature beneath a decree designed to sever Meghan from every remaining form of palace-recognized royal status she had fought to preserve, turning years of tension into one irreversible act. No carefully worded compromise, no ceremonial middle ground. Just a pen lifted from the page, a silent room, and a decision powerful enough to redraw relationships inside the House of Windsor almost instantly. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles remained seated after the final stroke, staring at the page as if the ink had changed the room. The decree, a formal written command from the sovereign governing palace recognition, now removed Meghan's remaining ceremonial precedents, official representation rights, patronage standing, and palace-controlled royal styling. These were not decorative details. They determined how the institution could present her, where she could stand officially, and whether any department could still treat her as carrying royal authority. The king slowly removed his glasses and placed them beside the papers. An aide waited nearby, careful not to fill the silence. Charles did not look relieved or victorious. The decision had been made, yet its weight settled harder after the signature. He knew the decree would be read as final, because its language left almost no room for quiet reversal. Meghan felt that finality from thousands of miles away. She read the notification twice, stopping over the paragraph explaining that future palace recognition could only be restored through direct sovereign approval. Her first response was not fury. It was disbelief. The fight she had treated as unfinished had suddenly become a closed institutional judgment, and the wording made clear that personal relationships would no longer be enough to reopen the door. William already knew exactly what those words meant. The prince had reviewed the final language before his father signed it, revealing something more consequential. This was not designed merely to survive the present reign. The future king had helped ensure that palace offices could not quietly return privileges later through precedent, courtesy, or private sympathy. That detail changed everything. Charles had not simply settled a dispute for today, he had built a barrier meant to endure tomorrow. And once Meghan understood that, the decree stopped feeling like one man's decision and started feeling like the monarchy itself had clearly, permanently chosen where she would stand. To understand why one signature carried this much emotional weight, we have to leave the document behind and look at the people whose identities, loyalties, and deepest wounds were tied to every line Charles had just approved. For Meghan, this was never only about a title written before a name. It was about belonging, legitimacy, and whether the institution she entered would permanently define her as someone who had walked away, or someone who still possessed a place inside its history. Across the distance separating California from the palace, one uncomfortable truth now settled in. Charles had transformed an argument about royal identity into a verdict on it. Meghan kept returning to the same painful contradiction. She had stepped away from full-time royal duties, but she had never stopped understanding how deeply royal identity shaped public perception, family position, and ceremonial standing. Those things mattered because they decided whether she was treated simply as Harry's wife or as someone still carrying a recognized place inside the wider royal structure. The decree had now drawn that distinction with brutal clarity. Harry watched her read the notice again, already knowing which question was coming. Meghan finally looked up and asked whether his father truly meant it to be permanent. The silence before his answer was brief, but it was enough. He knew Charles had not written this as a warning, and she understood from his hesitation that there was no hidden reassurance waiting behind the official language. The king felt the same conflict from the opposite side. Charles could separate family from institution on paper, but he could not make that separation painless in real life. He could tell himself that removing Meghan's official standing did not mean rejecting his son's chosen family, yet he knew Harry would feel both decisions in the same place. That was the burden the monarch had accepted when he signed. Harry soon discovered something even harder. The decree did not simply change how Meghan might appear at one future event. It altered palace protocol, the internal rules that determine how royals are formally recognized and included, meaning gradual reconciliation alone could not quietly rebuild what had been removed. William's role made the decision feel heavier still. The prince had not simply been informed once everything was finished. He had already taken part in discussions about preventing future palace departments from weakening the decree through exceptions, courtesy, or changing custom. The future king wanted the boundary to remain clear, long after the emotion of the present crisis faded. That realization left Meghan facing something more final than anger. Charles had closed one door, and William had helped make sure it could not slowly drift open again. Yet the decision had not appeared from nowhere. Behind it was one private confrontation, one exchange where patience finally gave way, and the possibility of compromise began to disappear. And behind that confrontation was a single moment, one exchange at a royal gathering, that palace insiders would later remember as the instant patience finally broke. Every royal rupture has a moment people later identify as the beginning of the end. In this story, it came during what was supposed to be a carefully controlled family gathering, when one private conversation shifted from reconciliation to accusation within minutes. Charles entered believing boundaries could still be negotiated. Meghan entered believing recognition could still be reclaimed. By the time the door opened again, both understood that the argument had become something far more serious. Meghan had spent months trying to understand what kind of place could still exist for her around future family-linked royal occasions. She was no longer seeking a return to full-time duties, but ceremonial recognition still mattered, because it shaped whether the palace treated her as part of its formal world or only as Harry's wife. Charles had resisted locking every door, hoping limited flexibility might preserve room for reconciliation without restoring official authority. The tension finally broke at Windsor. After a family commemorative gathering, Meghan challenged the king directly in a private conversation, asking how she could be welcomed as part of Harry's family while still being excluded whenever palace ceremony became official. Ceremonial status, in simple terms, governs how someone is formally placed, acknowledged, and represented at royal events. To her, that distinction no longer felt technical. It felt personal. Charles answered more sharply than anyone expected. He told her that affection could not automatically restore institutional authority, because royal recognition carried consequences beyond family feeling. Meghan pushed back, saying symbolic exclusion still communicated rejection, whether the palace intended it or not. Harry watched the exchange tighten, realizing his wife and father were no longer arguing over wording. They were defending two completely different ideas of fairness. The room changed after that. Meghan left first, carrying the sting of a conversation she believed had confirmed her worst fear. Harry followed soon after, torn between anger at the king's tone and the realization that neither side had left any easy ground for compromise. William remained behind. The prince warned Charles that ambiguity might feel compassionate now, but could become a much larger problem during the next reign. He argued that unclear ceremonial boundaries could force future officials to keep reopening the same dispute whenever invitations, appearances, or royal representation were discussed. Charles understood the danger. Later that evening, he asked his private secretary for formal options that could permanently separate private family membership from official royal recognition. That request became the first direct step toward the decree he would eventually sign. The argument at Windsor, created the problem Charles could no longer ignore. The meeting that followed would determine whether he still intended to compromise, or finally impose a boundary Meghan could not negotiate away. There were no cameras, no public smiles, and no ceremonial choreography to soften what happened next. Charles and Harry sat across from one another in a private room, with the future of Meghan's royal position between them. The king wanted clarity, his son wanted flexibility, and when Harry realized the decision had advanced far beyond another family discussion, the temperature of the room changed almost immediately. Harry knew why he had been called in, but he had not expected the proposal to be this final. Charles had arranged the meeting before approving the decree because he wanted his son to hear the reasoning directly, not through an aide or official notice. The document was no longer about one invitation or one ceremony. It was designed to create a permanent line between being part of the sovereign's family and holding official royal standing, meaning family connection would no longer guarantee ceremonial authority or palace privileges. Harry leaned forward and asked the question he had clearly been carrying into the room. Was Meghan being punished because she had refused to remain silent? The king did not avoid the accusation. Charles answered that the conflict had moved beyond public criticism. To him, the central issue was whether someone could continue benefiting from royal authority while no longer carrying the duties, limits, and responsibility attached to that authority. The answer landed hard. Harry pushed his chair backward, then stopped speaking. Charles did not rush to fill the silence. For several seconds, neither man moved toward compromise, and that small pause exposed the truth more clearly than another argument could have done. Father and son were no longer trying to reshape the same solution. They were standing on opposite sides of a decision that was already becoming real. Charles then revealed how narrowly the final wording had been constructed. Harry's family relationship would not be erased, and the decree would not pretend Meghan had never been part of royal history. But her institutional pathway back would be closed. Reconciliation could repair personal contact, yet it would not automatically restore ceremonial standing, patronage authority, or official representation. Harry felt another blow when William's role surfaced. The prince supported the permanence clause, a provision designed to prevent the order from fading away through future exceptions or quiet palace adjustments. That meant, even if Charles softened emotionally later, the next reign might still preserve the boundary exactly as written. Harry left the meeting believing his father had made the final choice, but the deeper architecture of that choice had been shaped elsewhere. The king held the pen, but the logic behind the decree had been sharpened by someone thinking less about yesterday's wounds and far more about the monarchy Meghan would face after Charles. William did not need to raise his voice to change the direction of the crisis. While Charles carried the emotional burden of being both monarch and father, the future king approached the problem differently, as something he might inherit unfinished. For him, uncertainty was the danger. If Meghan's position remained undefined, every future ceremony, invitation, and reconciliation could reopen the same dispute. His solution was severe precisely because he wanted the argument to happen only once. William understood that anything Charles left unresolved could eventually become his responsibility. That made Meghan's position more than a family dispute. It was a succession problem, because the next sovereign would inherit every unclear rule, every exception, and every argument the current reign failed to settle. Ceremonial precedence and official recognition mattered, because they signaled who could stand, speak, or appear with authority connected to the crown. The prince reviewed the draft quietly and stopped at the clause requiring direct sovereign approval for any future restoration. He knew exactly what it would mean for Harry. Personal reconciliation would no longer be enough to rebuild Meghan's former position through small steps, private favors, or changing moods inside the palace. William could see Catherine noticed the strain before another discussion began. She asked him quietly whether he truly believed the decree was necessary. William did not give her a cold answer. He told her that necessity did not make something painless, and she immediately understood what he meant. The future king was not trying to punish his brother. He was trying to prevent the same conflict from being handed to the next reign. William had also pressed for language-blocking informal accommodations, from slowly recreating Meghan's old standing. A single exception could become precedent, meaning one special decision might later be used to justify another. He wanted that possibility closed before it could grow. Charles resisted the harshness at first. The king understood that a softer document might leave emotional room for Harry, but he also saw the danger his son had identified. If the decree remained vague, William could one day be forced to repeat the same painful confrontation under even greater pressure. That realization finally changed the balance. The strategy was now complete. William had helped close the loopholes on paper, and Charles had accepted the logic behind them. But written rules were still only words until they entered real life. Now Meghan was about to discover what those carefully chosen sentences looked like when translated into an actual royal door being closed. The most painful consequences rarely arrive with trumpets. They arrive in ordinary messages, altered invitations, and suddenly formal language where warmth once existed. Meghan's first proof that Charles's decree was not symbolic came when arrangements for an upcoming family-linked royal occasion reached Harry. His name remained connected to the family element. Hers appeared under a separate protocol classification. One document had already begun changing how the palace saw her. Meghan read the revised wording slowly, then lowered the page onto the table. Across the palace system, the decree was already being applied to protocol lists, ceremonial planning, patronage records, and internal guidance for future appearances. Protocol, in plain terms, meant the rules deciding how members of the royal family were formally placed, recognized, and included. That mattered because Harry still belonged by birth, while his wife was now being treated differently the moment a family occasion crossed into official royal business. Harry watched her face change before she said anything. Meghan finally admitted that she now understood what permanent really meant. The anger that had carried her through earlier arguments gave way to something quieter and harder. She was not simply losing access to a ceremony. She was watching an identity she had fought to preserve being dismantled, piece by piece, through language that left almost no room for interpretation. Harry felt the division just as sharply. His own connection survived automatically, while hers no longer did. That imbalance left him carrying a guilt he could not easily explain. Every invitation that still recognized him risked reminding Meghan of what had been removed from her, and every official distinction threatened to turn husband and wife into two separate categories inside the same family. The boundary tightened further when palace staff received new instructions. Any exception would require approval from the highest level, preventing private sympathy or personal relationships with individual royals from quietly overriding the decree. The message was unmistakable. Informal kindness could continue, but it could no longer rebuild official standing. Charles received confirmation soon afterward that the first protocol changes had been implemented. The king read the memorandum, set it down without comment, and asked only one question: whether Harry had been informed. He had already accepted the institutional consequence, but his concern for his son had not disappeared with the signature. That concern was about to matter more than any document. The decree had already separated status from family, but when Charles and Harry spoke alone, they would discover whether anything personal could survive what the institution had just made permanent. For once, there was no private secretary, no constitutional language, and no draft waiting on the table. There were only Charles and Harry, father and son, speaking after the decision neither could now pretend was temporary. The anger had burned down into something quieter. Harry wanted to know whether the decree meant Meghan would never truly be accepted. Charles needed him to understand that acceptance and royal authority had finally become two completely separate things. Harry knew the conversation had changed because implementation was already underway. There was nothing left to threaten, delay, or bargain over. The decree had moved beyond theory and into palace practice, which meant father and son were no longer discussing whether the boundary would exist. They were discussing what it had done to the people standing on either side of it. Charles tried to make the distinction as clearly as he could. Meghan remained Harry's wife, part of his son's family, and permanently connected to royal history through that relationship. But the king insisted that family belonging was no longer the same as institutional standing. In this context, institutional standing meant the formal authority, ceremonial recognition, and official role the monarchy itself was prepared to acknowledge. Harry told his father exactly how Meghan would hear that explanation. She would see the decree as proof that the palace had never truly intended to forgive her. Charles did not argue with the emotion behind that. He admitted that he could not control how the decision felt from her side. He could only explain why he believed leaving the question unresolved had become more damaging than finally answering it. The silence that followed carried more weight than another confrontation. Harry eventually said he would protect his wife, even if that meant accepting permanent distance from parts of royal life. Charles did not challenge him. The monarch understood something painful in that moment. Fatherhood could not demand that loyalty move in only one direction, and his son would not choose the palace over his marriage simply to make the family conflict easier. Charles then told him something he had not emphasized before. He had rejected harsher proposals that would have pushed against Harry's own birthright position. The decree had been built as a boundary around Meghan's official status, not as an attempt to erase his son from the family entirely. Harry finally understood the larger strategy as well. William's future reign had shaped the decision from the beginning. What felt like one father's judgment was also the monarchy choosing long-term continuity over restoration. Behind closed doors, father and son had reached a painful understanding. Beyond those doors, Britain was already turning one royal signature into a national argument about belonging, duty, and who gets to define the crown. By morning, the decree no longer belonged to Charles, Meghan, or Harry. It belonged to the public. Broadcasters reduced years of private conflict to a few brutal words. Newspapers turned the king's signature into a symbol of final separation. Outside royal gates, supporters and critics argued over whether Charles had defended the crown or deepened his family's wounds. And one front page captured the entire crisis with an image impossible to ignore. Meghan watched the coverage beside Harry as the story spread across Britain and far beyond it. Commentators framed the decision in two sharply different ways. Either Charles had finally protected the monarchy from years of uncertainty, or a father had chosen institutional order at a devastating personal cost. Palace communications tried to draw a firm line between private family relationships and formal royal standing, meaning Meghan had not been erased from the family itself, only from the official structure of the crown. The coverage became harder to ignore with every hour. Meghan listened as one broadcaster repeatedly described the decree as final, then reached for the remote and switched the television off. Harry did not immediately speak. She had spent years fighting over how her royal chapter would be understood. But now the public meaning of that chapter was being written around her, not by her. Charles faced the same storm from inside the palace. An aide placed the morning coverage before him, expecting the king to focus on accusations aimed directly at his judgment. Instead, his attention settled on a photograph of Harry beneath one of the headlines. The monarch had accepted criticism when he signed the order, but seeing his son turned into the emotional center of the story exposed where the decision still hurt most. The public moment became impossible to miss. A major London newspaper carried a front page dominated by a close image of Charles signing official papers beneath the fictional headline, "The Final Line." Near Buckingham Palace, a crowd gathered as television crews recorded competing reactions, some praising the clarity, others condemning the human cost. One broadcaster called it the clearest institutional separation between Meghan and the working monarchy since her departure. That description changed the scale of everything. What had begun as a private royal argument was now a public milestone. Harry could no longer describe the situation as temporary. Meghan could no longer treat restoration as an unfinished negotiation. Even Charles could not soften the meaning once millions had seen the decree as the final boundary. Once the headlines faded, only the consequence remained. And for Charles, Meghan, Harry, and William, that consequence would define what each of them had chosen to protect. In the end, Charles's signature did something years of arguments, interviews, reunions, and private negotiations had failed to do. It created certainty. Meghan lost the remaining palace-recognized status she had struggled to preserve. Harry remained bound to both his wife and the family into which he was born. William inherited a clearer future, and Charles secured the institutional boundary he believed the monarchy required, but only by accepting that some family wounds would never fully close. Meghan finally stopped looking at restoration as an unfinished battle. The decree had settled her ceremonial authority, palace privileges, and official path back into royal representation, meaning the institution no longer recognized a route by which gradual reconciliation alone could restore her former standing. In a private conversation with Harry, she told him that whatever came next had to be built around the life they actually possessed, not the position she had once believed could still be recovered. Harry listened, knowing that acceptance did not erase the hurt, but it did end the exhausting uncertainty. Charles felt no sense of victory when the final implementation report reached him. The king closed the folder, instead of reading every line again. He had solved the institutional problem, but he could not pretend that a monarch's decision could repair the emotional damage underneath it. His son remained his son. Meghan remained part of Harry's family, yet the crown had now drawn a distinction that affection alone could no longer undo. William received something very different from triumph as well. The prince now faced a future in which ceremonies, official appearances, and questions of royal recognition would no longer force him to reopen the same dispute. That clarity mattered, because succession transfers unresolved problems as surely as it transfers responsibility. Still, the future king understood that clearer rules had come at a human cost, and no carefully written clause could hide that. Harry chose his marriage without demanding another negotiation. At the same time, he refused to erase his relationship with his father, simply because the institution had chosen a harder boundary. His resolution was not perfect reconciliation. It was acceptance that two loyalties could survive even when they no longer moved comfortably together. The final meaning was unmistakable. Charles had ended the attempt to preserve two incompatible realities. Meghan could remain part of royal history without holding a place inside the monarchy's governing structure. The crown chose definition over ambiguity, while she chose a future beyond the recognition she had fought to retain. Neither side received everything it wanted, but both finally received what years of conflict had denied them: an ending. And that is why the signature mattered. It did not erase Meghan from royal history, nor did it erase Harry from Charles's heart. It simply drew a line that every person involved could finally see. And once Charles lifted his pen from that decree, the struggle over where Meghan stood inside the monarchy was over. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.